Something significant shifted in the conversation about the British monarchy this week. Not in the tabloids, not in anonymous social media speculation, but in a direct, documented, public statement from one of the most credentialed royal observers in Britain, a respected royal author who has spent decades studying the internal mechanics of the Windsor family, who has interviewed palace insiders, reviewed classified correspondence, and documented institutional behavior that most journalists never get close to, has issued a formal call for King Charles III to abdicate. Not step back, not take a leave of absence, abdicate. And the reasoning behind that call, the specific evidence cited, the timeline of decisions documented, and the institutional failures identified deserve serious examination. Because this isn't commentary from someone with a grievance or an agenda. This is a conclusion reached after years of methodical research by someone who understands how this institution actually functions beneath its carefully managed public presentation. Before we go deeper, subscribe right now and activate notifications. This story is developing on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the next several weeks will produce revelations that reshape how the public understands the monarchy's recent history. Hit the like button. And tell me in the comments, do you believe institutions should be held to higher standards of accountability than individuals, or does the protection of an institution sometimes justify concealment? I want your genuine answer, because that question sits at the exact center of everything we're about to examine. Let's establish the context that makes this week's call for abdication significant rather than sensational. The British monarchy has navigated serious crises before: the abdication of Edward VIII, the devastation of Diana's death, and the palace's catastrophically misjudged initial response. The breakdown of multiple royal marriages conducted under relentless public scrutiny. Each of those moments threatened the institution's standing, and each time, through some combination of adaptation and public patience, the monarchy survived. What's happening now is structurally different, and the royal author making this abdication call has identified precisely why. The previous crises were fundamentally about behavior, about choices that were embarrassing or tragic or poorly handled, but that didn't implicate the institution in deliberate, sustained concealment of potential criminality. What the current situation involves, according to documented research rather than speculation, is a pattern of institutional decision-making over more than 15 years that prioritized protecting the monarchy's reputation over cooperating with legitimate accountability processes. That distinction matters enormously. Surviving a scandal about behavior requires managing public perception. Surviving a scandal about institutional concealment of potential crimes requires something different. It requires demonstrating that the institution is capable of genuine accountability. And that demonstration, the royal author argues, cannot come from Charles. Here's why the timing of this call matters. King Charles was confronted publicly earlier this week during an engagement. Someone in the crowd asked him directly, loudly enough for surrounding people to hear clearly, whether he had known about his brother Andrew's connections to Jeffrey Epstein, and whether the palace had actively worked to shield Andrew from the legal consequences of those connections. The question itself wasn't new. Versions of it have been circulating in royal coverage for years. What was new was the location, the directness, the fact that it happened publicly rather than in the controlled environment of a media interview where responses can be prepared and managed. Charles's visible reaction to the question told observers something, not because of what he said in response, but because of what the question's public emergence represents about where the broader conversation has arrived. That same evening, a palace statement was released indicating that the king stood ready to cooperate with any police investigation touching on matters related to Prince Andrew. The statement was carefully worded, legally precise, clearly drafted by people who understood both what it needed to say and what it needed to avoid saying. The royal author's response to that statement was immediate and unambiguous. He described it as reactive image management rather than genuine accountability. He pointed out that offering to cooperate with a potential future investigation is meaningfully different from proactively providing information that investigators should have been given years ago. And then he said what he's been building toward for 5 years of research. He said Charles should step down. To understand why this conclusion has weight, you need to understand what this researcher has actually documented. He spent 5 years attempting to access government files related to Andrew's tenure as a UK trade envoy. This was an official government role. Andrew travelled internationally, representing British commercial interests. He was accompanied by diplomatic staff. His activities generated official documentation within government departments, whose records are subject to freedom of information processes. 5 years of requests, 5 years of appeals through official channels, 5 years of stonewalling, legal challenges to his access requests, and in several instances, direct pressure on people he was attempting to interview to decline participation. When researchers face that level of institutional resistance over that length of time, regarding what should be relatively routine government documentation, it's not a bureaucratic inconvenience, it's a signal. It tells you that what's in those files is considered sufficiently damaging that significant institutional energy has been deployed to keep it inaccessible. What he was able to establish through alternative sources and documented evidence that couldn't be suppressed tells a story that the restricted files presumably tell in greater detail. The financial questions surrounding Andrew's trade envoy activities involve more than personal embarrassment. The role was publicly funded. Andrew was operating as a government representative. Allegations that he was sharing confidential information, that his official activities created access opportunities for individuals who subsequently turned out to have serious criminal exposure, that expenses submitted through official channels funded activities that bore no relationship to legitimate diplomatic work. These aren't allegations about private behavior in private spaces. They're allegations about the misuse of public resources and public trust in a publicly funded role. The standard of accountability that applies isn't the standard that applies to private citizens making personal choices. It's the standard that applies to public servants exercising public responsibilities. And the palace knew. That's the central argument of the abdication call. Not that Charles committed the acts attributed to Andrew, but that Charles, and before him the late Queen, received information about Andrew's conduct, received it repeatedly from multiple sources over years, and made deliberate institutional decisions about how to manage that information rather than how to address it appropriately. People who came to the palace with concerns about Andrew were turned away. Journalists who pursued documented leads faced legal pressure. Authors requesting access to relevant documentation were blocked through processes that required institutional coordination and institutional resources to sustain over years. That level of sustained protective effort doesn't happen through inertia. It requires active decision-making by people with authority to deploy institutional resources. Understanding who made those decisions and on whose authority they were made is precisely what a genuine accountability process would establish. What makes this institutional protection particularly troubling is the timeline. This wasn't a panicked response to sudden public exposure. This was a sustained, coordinated effort spanning more than a decade. Legal teams were briefed. Palace communications staff were aligned. Government liaisons were managed, journalists were warned. The consistency and longevity of the protective operation suggests not crisis management, but institutional policy. A deliberate, ongoing decision that concealment was preferable to accountability. That conclusion, if accurate, implicates not just individuals, but the entire decision-making culture at the top of the institution. The security dimension of what the researcher has documented adds a layer that extends beyond royal scandal into national security territory. Andrew's international activities during his trade envoy period brought him into contact with individuals who were subsequently identified as having connections to foreign intelligence services. Russian intelligence, Chinese intelligence. These are not vague allegations sourced from anonymous tips. These are connections that have been documented through subsequent investigations, court proceedings, and intelligence community assessments that became partially public through legal processes. A senior member of the British royal family with access to government officials, state events, and classified contexts who had developed relationships with individuals connected to hostile foreign intelligence services represents a national security concern that should have generated a very specific institutional response. The response that was generated instead appears, based on available documentation, to have been focused primarily on keeping the information from becoming public, rather than on addressing the security implications with the agencies whose job it is to address exactly those implications. The Metropolitan Police's conduct in relation to Andrew-related allegations has generated its own set of questions that the royal author addresses directly. The pace at which the Met has moved on matters that would have generated significantly faster institutional response if the subjects were private citizens rather than members of the royal family reflects either extraordinary procedural caution, or something else. The researcher doesn't characterize it as corruption. He characterizes it as a pattern of institutional behavior that has the same practical effect as corruption, regardless of the motivations involved. When accountability processes move at the speed of institutional comfort, rather than the speed of legal obligation, the people who should be subject to those processes benefit from the delay in ways that have nothing to do with their innocence or guilt. Now, let's address the abdication argument directly and specifically, because it's easy to call for an institution's head when you're angry about its failures. The researcher isn't doing that. He's making a specific structural argument. Charles cannot lead the accountability process that the current situation requires. Not because he's necessarily guilty of the most serious allegations circulating, but because he is institutionally implicated in the decision-making that created the current crisis. He was present during the years when these protective decisions were being made. He benefited from the institutional stability that those decisions were designed to preserve. He now heads the institution whose conduct is being questioned. An institution cannot credibly investigate itself. A leader who was present during the period under scrutiny cannot credibly lead the accountability process regarding that period. These aren't radical propositions. They're the foundational logic behind independent investigations, special counsel appointments, and every other mechanism democratic societies have developed for addressing situations where the normal chain of accountability is compromised by the conflict of interest at its top. What the researcher is arguing is that the monarchy's best chance of surviving this crisis in a form that retains genuine public legitimacy requires separating the institution's future from the specific individuals whose decision-making during the relevant period is itself under scrutiny. William is identified as the reason this transition is structurally possible rather than merely theoretically desirable. Not because William is perfect or because his reign would be free of challenges, but because he was not part of the institutional decision-making during the period in question. He has, by multiple accounts, expressed private discomfort with how the Andrew situation was being handled at various points. He represents a genuine generational break rather than a continuation of the same leadership under a different name. The researcher makes a point about William's approach to institutional transparency that's worth noting. William has consistently, across multiple contexts, pushed for the monarchy to engage more directly with accountability rather than defaulting to the protective mechanisms that characterized the previous era. He understands that the information environment has changed, that secrets have shorter lifespans in an era of social media and digital documentation, that attempting to suppress information that is eventually going to become public anyway doesn't protect the institution. It simply adds the suppression effort to the list of things the institution eventually has to answer for. And critically, William's public conduct over recent years has demonstrated something the researcher considers essential for what comes next. He has shown willingness to acknowledge institutional failure rather than deflect from it. He is engaged with uncomfortable public conversations rather than retreating behind palace communications. He has indicated through both words and decisions that he understands the monarchy's continued relevance depends on genuine accountability rather than managed appearances. That orientation, combined with his distance from the decision-making of the period under scrutiny, is precisely what makes a transition meaningful rather than merely symbolic. There's a broader pattern that the researcher situates this specific crisis within. Britain has grappled in recent years with institutional failures across multiple sectors where the same dynamic recurred. Powerful institutions discovered to have concealed information about the conduct of people within them. The concealment subsequently determined to have caused more damage than the original conduct would have. The individuals responsible for the concealment facing more severe judgment from the public than the individuals whose conduct was being concealed. The royal family's handling of Andrew follows this pattern precisely. If the palace had addressed the Andrew situation forthrightly when the connections to Epstein first became documented, the institutional damage would have been substantial but survivable. The concealment effort, spanning years, involving the deployment of legal resources and institutional influence to suppress legitimate inquiry, has transformed a scandal about one person's conduct into a scandal about institutional character. That transformation is what makes Charles's position structurally untenable, according to the researcher's argument. The question is no longer only what Andrew did. The question is also what the institution did in response to what Andrew did, and Charles cannot answer the second question credibly because the answer implicates the decisions made during his awareness of the situation. The parliamentary investigation call that forms the practical component of the abdication argument deserves attention because it identifies the mechanism through which genuine accountability could actually function. The palace cannot investigate itself. The Met has demonstrated institutional reluctance to move at the pace the situation warrants. The government files that document Andrew's trade envoy activities have been restricted through processes that appear designed to prevent their contents from reaching public accountability processes. Parliament has subpoena power. Parliament can compel testimony under oath. Parliament can compel the release of government documentation that has been withheld from Freedom of Information requests. Parliamentary committees have conducted investigations that produce genuine accountability in situations where other mechanisms failed. A parliamentary investigation into the specific question of what was known, by whom, and what institutional decisions were made in response would produce a record that the public is currently being denied. It would operate under processes designed for exactly this purpose, and it would function outside the institutional control of the palace and the Met, both of which have demonstrated that their self-interest is insufficiently aligned with genuine accountability to be trusted with the primary investigative role. The researcher's conclusion isn't presented as punishment for Charles, it's presented as the structural requirement for the monarchy's credibility to survive intact enough to be worth preserving. If Charles remains, and the accountability process is managed from within the institution whose conduct is under scrutiny, the process will produce results that look like accountability without functioning as accountability. The public has seen enough versions of that outcome in enough institutional context to recognize it quickly. The credibility loss from a managed accountability process that produces inadequate results may be worse than the credibility loss from a genuine accountability process that produces uncomfortable results. William, leading an institution that has genuinely separated itself from the decision-making of the previous era, cooperating with a parliamentary investigation rather than managing it, releasing government documentation rather than restricting it, could credibly represent a different institutional posture. Could credibly say this is not how we operate now, and have that claim carry weight because the transition itself would constitute evidence of institutional change rather than institutional management. The monarchy has survived crises before by adapting, rather than by successfully concealing. The adaptation required now is larger than previous adaptations. It requires acknowledging that the protective mechanisms deployed over the past 15 years caused damage that cannot be addressed through further protection. It requires genuine separation from the individuals and the decision-making culture that made those protective deployments possible. That genuine separation, the researcher argues, is what abdication represents. Not admission of personal guilt, not punishment for specific acts, but acknowledgement that the institution's future credibility requires leadership that isn't compromised by its past decision-making. Whether Charles reaches that conclusion himself, or is pushed toward it by the accumulating pressure of public scrutiny, parliamentary interest, and the relentless documentation of researchers who have spent years building records that cannot be suppressed indefinitely, the direction of travel is clear. The question is whether the transition happens in a way that gives the monarchy a genuine chance at the kind of credibility reset it needs to survive in its current form, or whether it happens too late, after too much further damage, to constitute anything other than a final attempt at damage control. The researcher's timing of this call isn't accidental. He's watched the institutional response patterns for years. He knows what managed retreat looks like versus genuine accountability. He's making this call now because the window for a transition that actually accomplishes something is narrower than it appears from outside. This story is not finished. It's barely entered the phase where the full documentation begins to surface publicly. Subscribe for continued coverage as each development arrives. Like this video if you believe accountability cannot be selective without destroying its own meaning. And comment with your genuine assessment of whether the monarchy can survive this in any form that retains real institutional legitimacy. Because that's the actual question underneath all of this. Not whether one man steps down, but whether the institution he heads can become something worth preserving after what it's been revealed to be. The answer to that question is being written right now. And it's being written not by palace communications teams or by sympathetic media coverage, but by the documented record that researchers like this one have spent years assembling. The record is becoming public, and public records in the end are what institutions are ultimately judged by. Stay informed. This matters beyond the palace walls.